G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru. Today I thought I'd cover a quick demonstration on a topic I've had requested quite a few times, which is how to set up a basic 4D simulation using Navisworks Manage or Navisworks Simulate. I am going to be using the 2020 version here, and I'm also using my basic sample project, which you can find on my website for free. And in this case, I'll just be showing you the various steps you'll need to go through in order to export your file, associate tasks to phases in a program that's built in Excel, and finally how you can animate your project. And you'll see here there's actually a couple of times we crashed as well, so it might be a good example of places you might wish to save your work just to be safe. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so we're going to export this view to Navisworks, and we're going to apply a timelining sequence to all these elements. I am just going to uncrop the view and just hide this this floor, which is showing up in the view because it's not meeting a filter criteria in the model, but otherwise we're going to try to animate all of these elements. Now, you can use two types of sets to associate these elements when you're in Navisworks based on their properties. There are selection sets and search sets. Search sets will find new elements that satisfy the criteria of the filter, whereas selection sets are exactly what you assign to them in Navisworks. Now, we're going to use a combination of them. You probably could use entirely search sets because this model is quite data rich. It's just that sometimes it can be hard to pick up multiple elements in the same set, especially when they're working cross-category. So in this case, let's just export this model. So we're going to go Export, NWC. And under the Navisworks settings, in this case, I have made sure that I am converting all element parameters. I'm also not exporting my room geometry, and I'm also dividing my file into levels. So I'm going to OK that, and I'm just going to save, in this case, to a NWC file called Timeliner. And I'm going to append this inside Navisworks itself. So back in Navisworks, I'm going to append the NWC. And I'm just going to save this as an NWF so I can start working. So I'm going to go to viewport and just change my lighting to scene lights and my shaded, my color to shaded instead, just so it looks a little bit more like the Revit model. So let's begin by having a look at how we can break down our elements. So I've already built a little program on the side. You're welcome to build one if you're following along as well. I've made 4 columns, and I might actually make one extra column before I forget to, which will be called task type. And these are all construction tasks. So I'm just going to copy that for each. And I've just made an order column so that they fall in a sequence. I've named the tasks as well, so we're working on our foundations, our walls, and our slabs. We're then building up our roof deck and then building up our upper deck. And finally, the last thing we'll be doing is building the roof and the walkway to connect it all together. I've also assigned some start dates and end dates, so each phase essentially lasts for 1 week. I've just begun with a day and just added 7 days onto it each time, and then I've added 7 days to each of those phases so that they all basically meet week to week. I've then saved this as a CSV file, so I've just went to save as this PC, and I've made sure I picked the CSV file type and saved. So in this case, we need to actually start breaking down our elements by phase now. So our first elements are really easy. These are structural foundations. If I just select one of my structural foundations, I can see that the category of the element in its properties is really easy to isolate. So in this case, I'm going to say that we're looking for the element, and we're going to say the element's category must be equal to structural foundations. I'm going to find all, and I can see now I'm finding all the foundations in my model based on that property. And I'm going to make a search set. So to add these panels, if you don't see them, on the Home tab, you can click on Find Items and also Manage Sets. And then you can dock them just by clicking and dragging them around. So I'm going to rename this set to 1 Foundations. And while I'm here, I'm also just going to do one for walls, and also one for floors. So they're really easy. The next one we're going to look at is a little bit more tricky to isolate, and that is going to be these columns. So in this case, we can see that we have a lot of properties to deal with. Now, if you're not seeing all the properties that I'm seeing, just make sure that when you right click that you're setting your resolution to first object. That way you see all the properties of the object itself rather than the layer it belongs to. I believe if I go to layer, I may not see as many properties. So see here I'm selecting all the elements that belong to the layer level 1B, because we broke our file down by level. There we go. So in this case, we're going to be isolating these by their category, but also by their base level. So in this case, their base level is going to be level 1B, and it belongs to the property set of elements. So again, I'm just going to, in this case, refine my search to structural columns, but then I'm going to say my elements base level, and sometimes you might have multiple parameters depending on how many elements in your model have that particular parameter. Base level is one that appears a few times because I believe that columns and some other elements might have that property. But in this case, you should know if it works because your search set should find them. But we're going to say, does the base level equal to 1B? Find all. Now in this case, we've actually found too many elements. So what I'm going to do is find something unique about this element. In this case, its type contains 200 UB. So I'm just going to add an extra element, and I'm going to say, does the elements type, type, we're going to say, we'll say, does it equal, and we'll just have to find that specific family type. Now we can see we're just getting those supporting columns. Now the risk in this particular scenario is if those columns change in future, the search set won't find them. So you just need to be careful with some of these sets that you do revisit them and redefine them later. So in this case, I am going to call that lower columns. Now, there are other things where you can work cross type. So in this case, I know that we have multiple column types here. I want to pick up all these lower columns here because I can't really build my supporting structure for the roof deck until these columns exist. So in this case, I am going to also find the columns that belong with a base level of level 1A. I probably could have potentially searched a little bit more efficiently with these columns by maybe saying that their top level, in this case, is going to be different to the other ones that I was trying to not pick up. So if I find the top level parameter, it's level 1B as well. But the top level on these ones is probably something different. It's deck. So maybe I could do that instead. Maybe I'll say top level is equal to level 1B as well. Yeah, that's more efficient. So when you've made a change to a search set like this, you just right click on the set you want to update and just say update. And now the properties will be updated. So that's slightly more efficient because now if they change those next time, it won't matter. So the next thing we're going to look for is the columns that have a base level of level 1A. So in this case, I am just going to remove one criteria from my previous set and change this to level 1A. In this case, I may need to potentially refresh this set. Let's try this. I'll deselect, and then I'll try clicking again. Seems in this case it's not happy. I think we may need to potentially reconstruct this set. It can be a very temperamental program sometimes, Navisworks, in that sometimes it just will not, I just want to see that find all button, and obviously it's not going to play ball. That's a little frustrating. Let's just start more simply and just say that we're looking for structural columns, and we'll just get the base level equals to ground. There we go. Now that sort of worked and sort of didn't. We actually want equals to level 1A. That's better. Okay, so this is going to be our upper columns. The next thing we're going to do is a little bit more difficult. So now we're going to start collecting some elements through selection sets instead of search sets, because it's quite hard to pick up multiple elements on one set if they have lots of different properties and none of them happen to be in common. So I'm just going to select all of these elements by shift selecting all my sets so far and hiding them. Well, my next step is actually going to be my lower deck, and for this I'm actually just going to switch to select box and just pick these elements manually, and I'm going to do a selection set instead. So in this case, you can't actually necessarily change these elements in the model without impacting the selection set. That's one risk with it. It's not looking for any properties of the element, it's just literally picking specific elements instead. So in this case, I will just select and hide that specific set and keep going. Let's go back to our phases just to see where we're at so far, because we've got about halfway. So in this case, we have our foundations, walls, slabs, lower deck, middle columns, and lower columns. So I think in that case, I might have done two things out of sequence there. So I did my upper columns before my lower deck. That's okay. In this case, my lower columns actually belong to another phase as well, I believe. So I think I've skipped one step here. So we've got foundations, walls, slabs or floors. Lower deck is the next step, so I'm just going to rename that, because we are going to want these to be relatively easy to visually align when we bring in our timeline. In this case, I'm going to bring in my upper columns next, which is step 5. And in this case, my 6th step is my lower column, so that should be step 6, because we're going to build our lower deck after this. Okay, so step 7, we're now looking at getting the roof deck, and then the upper deck, and then the upper columns. So in this case, the roof deck, I am just including the columns in this phase, so I'm just going to line up this view and just try to select the box. All these elements, which I did, great. So I'm going to add these as a selection set. Just call this roof deck. And I'll hide these elements just to make it easier to select more of them as I go. I'm now going to try and just pick up my upper deck, but I might have selected a few too many elements, so that's fine. What you can do is switch back to select and just hold down Control, and you can remove them from the set. So in this case, I'm just going to keep making selection sets, but you probably could find ways to filter these elements down. I just don't want to necessarily take up too much time doing this. But in this case, you may be able to find that all these framing elements have a common level, in that they probably are all just structural framing sitting at ground floor. From here, I'm probably just going to go and get a few of the easier to select sets first. So this is my final set actually, so I'm just going to select my walkway. Currently we're at step 8, I believe, so step 11 will be the walkway, so I'm going to selection set this. That's step 11. And then I'm just going to hide this. And the reason I've done that is it's going to be much easier to select the columns right at the end, because the last thing I'm going to select is my roof frame. So in this case, I have been a little bit lazy at the end just by mostly using selection sets. But in this case, this last step, we might be able to isolate these elements together. So in this case, we have base levels on these columns of ground floor. So we should be able to go and recycle one of our old column selectors. So we can make that into a search set at the very least. Okay, so at the moment, we're just going to go and sort this browser just so it's in sequence. And we'll just unhide all the elements. And we're going to use this program we've constructed to attach these sets to those phases. So in this case, I'm going to give myself a little bit more width to play with. And I'm also just going to click on my timeliner panel, which you can also access up here. And I'm just going to pin it as well. Okay, so now we need to load in our data source, which is a CSV file. You could use other things like MS Project files. I just know that not many people actually have MS Project, so I find it better to construct my programs in Excel if I'm doing a task like this. Now it's going to try and ask us to match up fields in our table. So our task name in this case is going to be called task. Our task type is going to be our task type column. Our display ID is going to be the order. Our planned start date is going to be start, and our planned end date is going to be end. I believe this is the minimum number of fields you would need to actually bring in a program. I might just also make the synchronization ID order as well. I believe everything else in here is quite optional, so we're just going to OK that. Right click our data source and rebuild our tasks from this. And we'll just double check. So it looks like the task type didn't successfully pick it up. Okay, because it's called construct. Instead of construction. So that is one problem. If you do try to pick out some of the fields that have automatic naming, you may sometimes get them wrong. So let's just try replacing construction with construct. And we'll just try updating our data source. So I'll synchronize with my... well, I guess that happens. So there we go, we crashed. So I'll just reopen it. As you can see, you know, Autodesk software doesn't always do what it's meant to do, unfortunately. Luckily I saved right before I started doing this. So in this case, now that we've called this construct, it should hopefully line up with our task type. And then we should be able to at least automatically collect this. So I'm just going to save this file and just make sure I'm saving to the original file. Great. I'll just make sure that my selection's all working. Great. I'm just going to pin my clash detective, and I'm going to load my timeliner. Pin it, and in this case we'll just try that again. I'm going to add that CSV data source timeline, and we're going to add Okay, so it looks like in this case our task type has actually been messed up. I'm going to go back to my Excel file instead, which is a little bit cleaner than the CSV, and we're just going to reconstruct. I've messed up my data a little bit. I'm just going to use a little Excel trick. I'm going to use data, text to columns. I'm going to do it by a delimiter, in this case a comma. This should work instead. Okay, so now we can replace this safely, and we should be able to reconstruct our CSV file a little bit more carefully. I must have edited out part of the CSV file structure by doing that. So I'm just going to resave my CSV timeline. And hopefully now it will detect the headers successfully, because it wasn't picking them up before. There we go. Okay, so now we can see it's actually found all those elements just based on their name, which is great. So I'm going to OK that, rebuild my task hierarchy. Come on. The program's definitely showing its age. And we can see now that it's automatically assigned the task type as well. So the last thing we need to do is actually associate elements to these phases. So I'm going to right click, attach set, and I'm just going to attach my sets one by one to their respective names. I believe there's some ways to automate this detection as well, as long as you name your sets the same as your task phases. But I know usually it's not quite that straightforward. Usually you might be attaching more than one set. But in this case, I'm just going set for set, upper columns, and then roof framing, and finally the walkway. So now all my sets are attached to tasks, so all my geometry technically belongs to a task. Now a really common problem is sometimes when you run a simulate, you don't see anything, and it's always just because the construct hasn't been assigned properly. So you do need to make sure that you have assigned the task type. That's probably the most common bug I see people make, or common error people make. But let's just go to simulate. And you should be able to see your first phase of elements just indicated in green. This is controlled under the configure tab, just showing the appearance of an element before it appears. So in this case, we can change that if you want to make that say yellow.
No, God!
Okay, so we're definitely seeing a lot of crashing today.
Please, no!
Far out, Navisworks. Obviously no one's taking care of you anymore. We'll go back again. I think I saved before that, fingers crossed, or hopefully it's saved to backup, but far out Autodesk. I'm not going to edit these out. I'm just going to show that Navisworks is not looking very stable these days. I'm not going to edit that out. Sorry, Autodesk. So I'm not going to try and change the appearance of that phase of elements, unfortunately, but ideally you should be able to change that without crashing Navisworks. I'll try right at the end and just see if it crashes every time. But if you do go to simulate and press play, you should see it cycle through each week of construction and build up your model piece by piece in an animated set. If you do know how to use the animate tools in here, whoops, it looks like I've missed those columns. They should be in a different order. But anyway, you can see otherwise that everything sort of builds in sequence. I did actually mistake the order of those particular columns there, but otherwise that looks pretty good. So we can see now that as you animate, you can actually just go through either step by step, or you can actually go through and animate them and move around the model as it builds in order. But otherwise, that's essentially a basic timeliner. I'm just going to go and check right at the end to see if this always crashes Navisworks. Wow.
No,
it always crashes Navisworks. There you go.
No,
might go to the
please,
forums and tell them
no.
about that. Anyway, otherwise, that's how you set up a basic timeliner simulation in Navisworks. I hope you found this interesting, and I guess it's been a good way to show some of the problems that are still lurking in Navisworks itself. So there we go, 3 crashes in one live demo. That's not great, is it? It really is starting to show that Navisworks may not necessarily be the best program of its type for much longer. I think this is probably just indicating maybe that might be the case. But regardless of that, whilst it still does continue to be one of the leading coordination platforms, hopefully this has shown you a new technique that you can use. But yeah, just be mindful that maybe the program might not necessarily be stable and may get less stable as people tend to ignore it for more years to come. Anyway, on a positive note, if you're looking for more videos like this in the future, feel free to follow and subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.